Hello, my name's David Bailey. I'm a Director of Aerospace Consulting. It's my pleasure to host this Northwest Aerospace Alliance workshop on sustainable aerospace and aviation. Apologies from Iain Minton, Head of Technology Programs for BAE Systems, who was due to chair this session, but unfortunately he's had to pull out at very short notice. We're going to talk about sustainable aerospace and aviation. And we've got a really good panel of speakers here. And what's going to be important is understanding how the plans of what we call the primes in our industry, the companies that make aircraft, make engines, how their future strategies will impact on the supply chain in Lancashire and what that might mean from an innovation perspective. So if I think about sustainable aviation, then first of all, I've got to think about what the United Kingdom has committed to. So UK has enshrined in law commitments to achieving net zero targets in terms of carbon by 2050. And the sustainable aviation commitment is also to net zero by 2050. So it's not as if that this can't happen, it has to happen. It's part of the government strategy, and we'll see later this year the United Kingdom host the next big climate change conference, COP26 in Glasgow. So it's a key policy item at the moment. We know that the aviation emissions are significant. They're between 2 and 3% of all of the world's output in terms of carbon. And we also know that the different aircraft types are likely to have different solutions in terms of how they achieve net zero. So what we can do with very small aircraft is quite different to what we can do with jumbo jets flying across the Atlantic. So there will be different types of technology applied to different sized aircraft. So whilst we might see batteries on smaller aircraft, we're more likely to see hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuels in larger aircraft. And one of the things we want to think about is what will that mean to different aircraft design, and therefore what will it mean to the supply chain. And we have to think about this as an opportunity for change. So some numbers that we saw prior to the pandemic said that whilst the global market for civil aerospace products, traditional civil aerospace products, out to 2035 was worth $6 trillion. That's trillion dollars. It's a phenomenal number. Actually, for this transition to electric aircraft, the opportunity is worth $17 trillion globally. So this is actually a big opportunity for the United Kingdom, which is number 2 in the world in terms of aerospace manufacture. So it's also a big opportunity for Lancashire. So I think I'd like to start with James around how does this technology shift to sustainable aviation impact the traditional aerospace supply chain? So all of the companies that we've got here are rooted in traditional aerospace design and manufacture. Natasha's probably a little bit more leading edge in that respect, but certainly James, David and Matthew represent organisations that are steeped in aerospace manufacture. What will this change mean to your organisation, James?
Depending on the time horizon that you look at, David, I think in the near term we'll see very little change apart from how our own organisations become more carbon neutral. But the technology shift, specifically for the UK market, the wing of the future from Airbus, will have a seismic shift in the industry around 2035, and we've really got to focus on what that means for us. And that will move away from metallic manufacture into more composite based, which I'm sure some of the panel will talk to. In terms of what we are doing as a company to try and manage that, we are looking at additive layer and how that is going to be one of the nearer term risks that pose to our current existing state of manufacture, method of manufacture, sorry. And then as we go forward, how composite comes into it. But one thing is clear, that there will be less touch time on a lot of the machinery that we currently have. So the drive to efficiency and automation is going to become even more important as we move forward.
Now, this whole sort of sustainable agenda has been building, particularly during the pandemic. I think it's accelerated during the pandemic. What does it mean to your organisation, David?
I think, similar to what James says, the traditional manufacturing processes, they will start to diminish, but it's how do you use them technologies to give your customers some short-term benefits. So we do a lot around hole drilling and cooling technologies, which gives the aviation more sustainable fuel life and things like that. So it's short-term, it's how you adapt your current processes to give the customer some small benefits, with a view to getting involved in the design with the customers to try and change their mindset for design to again help your technologies to produce components that are fit for purpose going forward.
And I think that's an interesting point. So whilst a lot of the work that's been done in the UK recently around Future Flight Programme, around the Fly Zero programme, is about new architectures and new platforms, actually just making the existing aircraft more efficient and the engines more efficient is still contributing towards the targets. Matthew, how is it impacting Paradigm?
I think you can only echo the points made by James and David there. David, the actual, if you look at the actual what the requirements are for moving from your kerosene and your jet fuels over to sustainable aviation fuel, the actual combustion process is pretty much going to be still the same. So the geometry of the parts short term are going to stay the same. So it will affect us, as James said, but it won't affect us as much in the near term as it will in the long term future. So the geometry will be the same. There might be some design changes with the metallics and the materials that you use. But I think it is, just echoing what Dave said, it's one of the things that you've got to do is changing. And you've got to use this opportunity to provide solutions to your customers and be with them on that journey to any little small tweaks that they make, that you're there in terms of what they need to do to design the engine differently to make it more sustainable, make it greener. But also inwardly, you look at your own processes where you are contributing to the carbon effect, such as how you pull the power, recycling all your transportation media that you use within the factory, and then the little changes you can make immediately, whilst the bigger changes come through in terms of engine design. So short term, it won't change much other than embracing the way we do things different from a manufacturing perspective. Longer term, it's when they start doing more metallic and geometry changes, that's when it might impact what we do at the moment.
And I think it's interesting that I think I've seen a number of your organisations starting to develop new technologies, new capabilities around new manufacturing processes. You touched on additive layer. Why do you think that is going to be an opportunity going forward?
I think the additive is looking at the reduction of waste materials, for example, in the assembled parts and things like that. But the big change for us will be on how the components are redesigned, existing components, how are they redesigned to give better cooling. And again, better cooling gives better efficiencies and helps the sustainability. So things that you could never manufacture before, holes within complex shapes, are now being printed into the metallics. And whilst we see some of that of our process being eroded, it's important that we're still there, giving the customers the solutions from a design point of view. So what can you print, what can you still machine, and all that kind of thing. So and the other area is we're looking at the new powders that are being developed as well, and how do new powders come in and achieve the metallurgy that's what's required from a single crystal casting, which obviously is never going to happen, but we can get as near as we can to it.
James, have seniors started looking at additive layer?
Yeah, we have. It's mainly to look at supporting the manufacturing process, not the actual product itself. So manufacturing of fixtures to support more efficient and agile supply chains and turnaround times to support the solutions, as the guys have touched on there, to the customers. Longer term, we see, and we're already involved in projects that will mature in about the next 5 to 10 years to become volume driven. However, the acceleration of additive layer into true volume within the aircraft industry has not embedded itself as quickly as what everyone would have. We were sat here 5 years ago talking about this. I think we would have thought we'd have been a bit further down the path with that. I think another point, when we talk about innovation, and the one thing that our industry also needs to recognise is about process innovation. So we talk around all these brilliant technologies that are coming through, but the bit that we stop thinking about from an innovation point of view is to make sure that the process to adopt that technology to drive innovation also needs to have an innovative mindset applied to it. I think that's one frustration we probably all share, that the supply chain wants to drive forward at pace, but sometimes the primes, as you refer to, just we feel frustrated that we can't do it as quickly as we want to.
But I think we are entering into a time period where that might change a bit. So I think that the shift towards more sustainable aviation and aerospace might provide the supply chain with that opportunity. I'm certainly starting to hear bigger companies talking about their supply chain and how it deals with sustainability as being a differentiator for them. And that sort of brings me then into a discussion about not just sustainable aerospace platforms, but the sustainability of your businesses. I am going to come to you, Natasha, around unmanned air vehicles and around urban air mobility later, which is a big subject and also fits with this sustainability theme. But I just want to stick with this for a short while. So James, how at your senior aerospace site at EAB, how are you helping drive that to become more sustainable? So if we think about United Nations objectives, they talk about Scope 1 objectives as being the sustainability of your operations. Scope 2 is the sustainability of your energy supply. Scope 3 is the sustainability of the whole value chain. But I'm thinking really about your operations, the sustainability of that.
Good question, David. In terms of Senior PLC, which our location is part of, they've made a commitment that by 2030 they will be carbon neutral. And that is something that we measure in each facility. And I'm happy to say that Senior Aerospace Weston is number 2 in the league table of driving reductions. And in the last 2 years, we've driven in excess of a 40% reduction.
Excellent.
In terms of how we've gone about that, there's a lot of local initiatives, renewable energy, retaining your rainwater, solar panels, putting meadows into the fields around the facility. But the big thing that we see to drive innovation, the workforce don't just pay attention to it, they believe in a lot of the work that we're doing and a lot of the targets that we have. And the biggest initiative we've got going is an ideas board, which essentially, it's all the little challenges, the true problems, and innovation is about moving beyond the current norm. And at that basic level, the workforce and the engagement with the workforce is the biggest catalyst we've seen to really accelerate, from turning light switches off. How do we reduce our carbon footprint? That ideas process, which has got a reward and recognition element to it as well, has been the biggest driver. Some of the ideas have been brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and deservedly so recognised.
And are those ideas coming from all age demographics?
Yes, maybe there is a slight skew to experience, but the vast majority come from the hourly paid element of our business. But that's the most important part of it. I'm sure these guys will agree that's where the true value is.
Excellent. David?
It's an interesting time for ELE at the moment, because we're just moving to a new premises, and it's really worked as a catalyst for us to start looking at renewable energies, so the solar panels on the roof, the electric chargers for cars and all that kind of thing. But there's some of the other processes as well that we do we use a lot of nitric acid at the moment, and historically it's been relatively cheap to buy and dispose of, but times are changing, and it's becoming more and more difficult. So we're looking at things like acid regeneration now and putting in a recycling plant at the new facility. So all that will help the business to protect the environment and to go more green. But similar to James says, the employee engagement and the employee buy-in is a significant change factor in this. And once we can get the mindset aligned, I think there'll be some good suggestions coming from the workers as well. And I think as well with some work that Burnley College is starting to do, we're starting to work with the colleges and the universities to see how they can help us with implementation.
Excellent.
Yeah, again, without sounding like a broken record, I'm going to echo what the guys have said there. Interestingly enough, we in terms of the demographic, where the ideas come from, because we likewise have idea generators. It's mainly come from the younger people. The only reason we can think of that is because they're probably more invested in the reasons why everybody's got to go green than some of the probably the older generation who are probably less. It won't be here when it happens without being too crude. But we're doing solar power. We're doing all the recycling, like we said. Again, we're recycling coolant and how we can do that. There's other things we are looking in terms of how we reduce power pull, which is one of the main ideas generators that we're getting, and it's kind of an interim step between the way the subtractive methods that we use over to additive, where you're trying to produce it as near to net shape, so you're taking off less material. Yes. And them are the kind of things that are coming through. And I think that, just going back to the point on additive, I think that's one of the biggest issues we're going to have, apart from the speed of change, is that the accessibility to additive and the costs inhibitors of getting really heavily into metallic additive are what's. We're going to get to a point in the aviation industry, because it is an expensive process, and that's one of the things. Whilst it reduces waste as such, and it's great for legacy parts and smaller volumes, when you get into volume production, how you do that cost effectively against the traditional methods is going to be a balance between going green and what the consumer wants, which is cost competitiveness, and that I think that's going to be something that we encounter at some point.
Natasha, what does it mean to a business like yours? You're in a high technology, more systems, electronics orientated. So what does sustainability mean to a business like that?
It's definitely shifted over the last year, obviously with COVID. So we found that working from home, for example, is definitely a lot more productive for most of the staff. Some of the engineers that have to be in the office to work in the lab, etc. The office is not closed. However, what we have found as well is, because all this technology is becoming more automated, so it's all about the AI and the video analytics and how we can really cut down that manual time. The business has doubled in the last year as well, so we've now had to increase the office size as well. So from a sustainability point of view, this is a good time for a little SME that can focus on R&D and can shift very quickly into what the next hot topic is. So it's definitely been a positive for us at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I think it is interesting. I've heard a number of companies say that it's young people within their organisations that are often driving the sustainability agenda, and that's great. But I think James makes a good point. It's often experience that might understand how to solve some of those problems. And I think certainly what I heard at the Northwest Aerospace Alliance's annual conference last week, was it last week, the week before? Was that combination of getting young people driving ideas, but with a mix of experience, of capability to make it happen, is what's going to be required to achieve the sort of targets that you're talking about by 2030. So it's really interesting that seniors have signed up to that, because it's quite a significant commitment. So it's happening, and I think we're going to need more collaboration around some of this. So if we're doing this in order to create a more sustainable industry, then it'd be a good idea, I think, to start to collaborate around more of this type of activity, because we should be sharing some of the bright ideas that come off each other's factory floors, in my view. Okay, I'm going to move on slightly now to more of the sort of what the next generation of urban air mobility could look like. So Roland Berger, in a piece of analysis that they did, estimated that there will be up to 160,000 commercial air taxis in the air by 2050. And that urban air mobility passenger industry, and what we're talking about here is vehicles flying people from airports into city centres sustainably. We're also talking about a small passenger number flying around regionally. That's going to generate revenues of almost $90 billion per year. So I think first question is really to Natasha, which is, you've got a lot of experience of unmanned air vehicles. Urban air mobility is a slightly bigger version of that. We've seen, for example, quite significant breakthroughs with the likes of Vertical Aerospace, Heart Aerospace in the last 12 or 18 months. They're talking about manufacturing aircraft in significant numbers. But in order to get to flying Uber taxis, what breakthroughs do you think we need to see before that market really happens? There's lots of investment going into it. If you look at, for example, global investment into the aerospace sector, it's all going into this area rather than into the traditional aerospace sector. So what's going to have to happen for that to break open and that market become real?
I think there's a lot of things that have to happen. I think for one part, as a citizen, to be told that you're being picked up from an airport by a machine and it's going to fly you somewhere, there's that trust sort of concept of it. So I think not only the regulations have to catch up and make sure that everything's secure, it's safe, everything's in place, we've won the people's buy-in. We also have to look at things like more efficient communication systems, that aspect of, can we, with all the confidence, say that this UAV can get from this place to this place, do what it needs to do, whether it's delivering people, medicine seems to be the next big thing, and whether it can actually get there safely, do what it needs to do and come back. Some of the areas that we've been asked to look into are around the communication systems. So not only speaking to a UAV, but also UAVs speaking to each other and having that concept that there's a mesh in the sky now and not just one flying somewhere and then flying back. Another huge issue that we've found is the how do we power these UAVs to make sure that they can get from A to B. Some of the smaller and medium-sized UAVs would typically last 30 minutes on a battery at the moment. So I think a lot of work has to happen there for us to be able to sustain the timeframes for a UAV to get from one place to the other. Another concept we've had more recently is sort of flipping it on its head a little bit, is the larger sort of infrastructures in place, like airports, power stations, that absolutely cannot have UAVs flying over and around them. There'll be a sort of a no-fly zone. How do they ensure that that's the case? How do they know that a drone's not going to go sort of rogue and fly over it? So for us personally, we're now looking at different algorithms and systems that can have perimeter controls for these infrastructures to make sure that if something does come over that line, that it's triggered straight away and then it's addressed. I mean, and you're talking about industries like Amazon, for example, that would do the parcels, huge amounts of traffic. So I think it's going to be a lot of issues, but a lot of opportunities, especially for SMEs. And just recently, following on from that topic of collaboration, we're now working with a number of SMEs in the Lancaster and South Lakes region, and we've created a cluster purposely to address hot topics like this. So we know as sort of 30 people in a little SME, it's going to be quite difficult for us to sort of penetrate that market. So now we're working together and seeing how we can collaborate to deliver funded projects, but also to speak to people like BAE, who we've got on board now. We have a contract with Heathrow Airport, for example. Another cluster of members speaks to Heysham Power Station. So we've got sort of those buy-ins as a cluster to really drive something bigger. So It's a lot of opportunities, but I think it's sort of filtering through and how we actually say what can we focus on, what can we achieve in the short term, medium term, long term. So it's definitely exciting.
But you made some really interesting observations there. I think the whole sort of the regulation side of it is still a huge barrier that we need to overcome. But you also raised the issue around infrastructure. So, you know, whether we're talking about Uber taxis or whether we're talking about Airbus A350s with sustainable aviation fuel or hydrogen fuel, you have to have the infrastructure to support that. And not just the infrastructure here, you have to have the infrastructure for wherever those aircraft go to support that. So I think that's a really interesting point. I'm just going to ask the other panel. I'm not going to ask the panelists about urban air mobility. I'm not sure it's necessarily their expertise, but how confident would you be flying in a Uber taxi, a pilotless vehicle at maybe a couple of thousand fleet flying over London? Matthew?
Well, I'm a gambler, David, so I'd give it. No, I mean, look, one thing is somebody won't put something up in the air. It'll be tested, regulated, and I think all the things the aviation industry do really well, which is in terms of making flights safe for the consumer. I can't see them not doing the same for that. It'd be, you know, it'll be different, but I don't think you can, for fear of doing something, not do it. So I'd have no problem with doing it, but I can understand why some people would. But for me,
I'm not going to ask you. I thought you answered that very, very well. Okay, last subject is actually a little bit wider than aerospace, but goes to the government's new 10-point plan for green industrial revolution. So this is the sort of strategy behind the government's net zero ambition, and it involves not just aerospace and electric cars, but also small modular nuclear reactors. It includes wind turbines. It includes a hydrogen economy. So what do we think that provides us with as opportunities? I know lots of us in the aerospace sector were talking about diversification during the pandemic. So does this net zero strategy of the government provide opportunities? I'm going to start that one with David.
If I'm totally honest, I'm not so sure. I know we've tried to do work with the nuclear industry previously, and it's proved difficult due to the low volume manufacturing. But I think the small nuclear devices will give some opportunity to us. But at this moment in time, I'm just not quite sure how that would develop and how that supply chain would set up if it's not already there, really.
Okay, have you looked at it, James?
A little bit, but a bit like the group here, not confident that it will deliver near-term opportunities. Change always does drive opportunity, let's be clear, and with that, well, the irony of one of the more recent developments is that a 25-year-old engine will actually form part of a nuclear reactor if you look at some of the initiatives that are going on.
Yeah.
So that automatically provides a platform for the existing supply chain to be part of these opportunities moving forward. But I think these are only going to work if it comes down to collaboration, which I think is a big key thing that's been mentioned by everybody.
Okay, I think we might have questions from the audience.
Yes, we have. Thank you. So one of the questions we've just had come in is, what are you doing to foster SMEs wanting to enter the aerospace industry?
I'll have a go at that first. Okay, so at the Northwest Aerospace Alliance annual conference 2 weeks ago, we had presentations from both BAE Systems and Leonardo Helicopters. BAE Systems were presenting on their Future Combat Air System, the Tempest program, where they're clearly looking for suppliers, particularly with new technologies. Leonardo Helicopters were specifically there looking for new SMEs to enter their supply chain for a new aircraft program, which is one of these unmanned air vehicle programs. So there are opportunities there, but I'd say you've got to bring something that makes you stand out from the other SMEs. So that's got to be either your performance in terms of quality, cost and delivery, or your technology in terms of being able to provide something different to what other manufacturers can provide. Anybody else like to add?
No, I think you're right. I think that's you hit the nail on the head there, David. I think the only thing I will say, I think with in terms of what the OEMs want and the stipulations they put in, they're very big on APQP as we went through. I think now the days of poor performance, poor quality have gone. I think that's a prerequisite. I know it's easier said than done, but I don't think you even get through the door unless you can demonstrate a good track record and sustainability on your delivery performance and your quality. I think the USP, what you can do differently and how you can be that in providing solutions or coming up with some new techniques that support the sustainable dream. I think them are the things which are going to be the extra 10-20% that will they'll open up doors amongst the supply chain.
David?
Yeah, it's all about the unique selling point. What can the supply chain or what can new suppliers give us that the existing supply chain doesn't? I mean, it is quite a long supply chain that we're involved in, and what you don't want is more of the same, really.
Do you have any more questions?
Yes. We've got one final question. It's been mentioned a few times today that the various sectors in Lancashire are experiencing skills shortages. Would you say that's the same for your sector?
Natasha?
I think yes. I think we have a big recruitment drive on at the moment. As I said, we sort of expanded in the last couple of months because of all the opportunities that we've had, and we've certainly struggled to get the resource that we need to deliver some of our projects, and we're finding that we're having to go outside Lancashire and sometimes outside the UK to get the resource that we need. So yes, I do think it's an issue for an SME.
James?
Yeah, I would agree with that. We're finding in the higher skilled area we've definitely got shortages right now, and while that is, especially when we're looking at recovery and 20% recovery in a lot of the volume platforms a lot of our companies support into next year, what it is as an opportunity, and when we come back to innovation, it's driving us as a company to drive projects quicker, to bring technology at an accelerated pace to mitigate the resource issues that we're currently facing.
I think it's one of the biggest issues for UK advanced manufacturing and engineering at the moment. We've got skills shortages across the board, and for me, particularly around manufacturing engineers, around team leaders, people who've got the ability to lead part of one of the business units that these guys represent. Those two always crop up in every discussion that I have with aerospace companies.
Great, thank you. Really interesting session there. Lots for people to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So just to finish, I'd like to thank the panel. I think we've had some really interesting feedback on the subject of sustainable aerospace and aviation, and what's been really useful for me is understanding where some of the strategies that our industry might deploy, how they impact on companies within the supply chain. We're often talking about what's going to happen with the likes of Airbus and Boeing, but what I'm interested in is what that means for companies like all of yours in Lancashire today. So that's been really useful. Thank you very much.